Let me introduce you to my parents. They are Liesl and Ernesto, and here they are at their engagement in Mannheim, Germany in 1933. A few months after the engagement, they were married, after which they moved to Madrid, Spain, in order to settle there. My father had already been working there for some time. My father sold toys as a traveling salesman all over Spain and Palma de Mallorca. And mother took care of the household. My father made this picture of me among the dolls. Dolls that he would sell. They were part of his samples. And I was born in 1935, just at the outbreak of the Civil War, after which we were expelled from Spain. We finally were able and allowed to settle in Mexico. This was after wandering all over Europe. And Mexico would be our home from then on. My parents had someone take this picture of them in the garden, and they sent it to my grandmother back in Germany. Another copy went into the family album in Mexico. And sometime later, my grandmother would return the picture she received, torn like it's here. She inscribed on the reverse of the image the following: torn, among other things, by the Nazis, the 10th of November of 1938. The horde arrived at 9:20 in the morning and stayed all day, where everything they saw, they either destroyed or stole. Right after the Second World War, my father had the idea that he could sell Japanese products in Latin America. So he set out for the Orient to set up La Exportadora Mexicana. Here he is with his staff and his three-dimensional camera. I felt like my father was Marco Polo. He would bring back these images, the promises of dreams and fantasies and discoveries. After his trips to Japan, he would then take all his samples and travel through Latin America, and going from town to town, setting up a showroom in his hotel room. Again, he would sell toys. But in addition to that, it was porcelain and cameras and sewing machines. And I think he even once sold motorcycles, and what seemed to me then to be some very funny balloons, which in time I would learn were condoms. As the years passed, I grew up, I got married, and also had one son by the name of Pablo. And here he is with my father, with whom he was always very, very close. This image is taken shortly before the doctors find that my father has cancer. This is in the medical center in Houston. My father is waiting anxiously to hear the results from the doctors in the hospital. My mother is calling downstairs to find out what happened. And I felt that here this man was like waiting to hear a sentence on his life. They were very painful moments. I took this picture as he's being told that he only had 4 to 6 weeks to live. The doctors refused to operate him as he already had cancer in both lungs and in the colon, and it didn't make sense to have him go through any more additional pain. And my mother was completely devastated, and she broke down really. She was totally devastated. And my father, he had the strength, and and was very protective of her. He was always a very strong man. And as a matter of fact, he then turned around and said to me, "You know, let's fight this out." And, well, as it turned out, he lived 3 years. He even outlived the doctors that prognosticated that he would live for only 4 to 6 weeks. And he said, "Well, why don't you go and return to Yuma to continue on your project, and when you finish there, come home." So he was in very good spirits, and took a shower, and he got all ready to return to Mexico. And it wasn't that he repressed what was going on. He just assimilated it and decided to be strong about it. He got dressed to fly back to Mexico City, and I was wondering if I really would see him again. He wished me well on my journey back, but I was at a loss of words. What could I tell him? Don't die before I return? This was the first image I made the day I arrived back in Yuma. And yet when I returned to Mexico, my father, I asked him if he would be good enough to let me take a special portrait of him. And he said, "Sure, what would you like me to do?" And I said, "Whatever you want to do." And he said, "Okay, I want to fly." I said, "Good, start to fly and I'll take the picture." So he started to fly. A year had gone by, and my father was fighting hard. He had lost a great deal of mobility. There was this complicity of tenderness between my mother and my father. Every moment became precious. They kissed and hugged each other all the time. My mother would take him out every day, very punctually, to walk. And he would fill his pockets with candies. He loved to give candies to children. And he enjoyed looking at children. And I was amazed when I saw this scene of this child being helped to walk at the same time as the old man, my father's, being helped to walk. Sort of, you're helped to walk, you're helped into life and you're helped out of life. and all going on at the same time. In this image here, we visited the doctor. My father had just returned from the United States, and they had found that he had a brain tumor in his head. And they had given him radiation. You can see that he had lost already his hair here through radiation. And we went to see the doctor because with the x-rays that they detected that he had a tumor in his brain, the doctor in Mexico had said he didn't have anything. And it didn't make sense, so we went to see the doctor to find out how he responded to that situation. So he looked at the x-rays again, and at that moment that my father is looking at in that way, my mother is looking in this direction. They're listening to the doctor apologizing for having misread the x-rays at a time when the tumor was very small. This is my father's birthday, and my mother was very interested in having him always have an environment where friends and relatives and people who cared for him would be around. This was a scene that I would find very often, that my mother would be there holding his hand for hours on end, and give him security, basically. Here she's giving him his medication. Something else that my mother made a big point, and that was to encourage his independence. In other words, to allow him to do as much as possible of things on his own, even helping him, instead of saying, well, look, you cannot do this, let me do it for you. The day I printed this image in the darkroom, I literally was in pieces. It was so hard to see my father sitting there on the toilet and being so completely vulnerable, having all those pains in his bowels and my mom trying to soothe him. It's interesting, he never complained about his pains. It was only until my mother would encourage him to say something that he talked about anything that hurt him. We always made sure that he would go for a short stroll to get some exercise and fresh air. The tumor in his brain grew, and this caused his eye to close. My father increasingly had difficulty in seeing, hearing, or talking. So much of his communication took place through holding hands. And here we closed his good eye to force his bad eye to work. The one that was closed in the other picture here is opened because we have the good eye covered. And this is my hand here. And you can see the incredible amount of energy and strength that he had, how he clasped onto my hand. And it was a grasp that it's always with me, that strength that he somehow conveyed to me. So we held hands together, and I was with one hand holding my camera, with the other hand holding him. Here he would look after my search with his other hand for my fingers. And sometimes my hands were blue. That strong was the pressure with which he held onto my hand. Really, the tips of my fingers were blue. We had to take him to the hospital, as he couldn't breathe easily anymore. I couldn't help but notice the marked difference in the way everyone at home would hold his hand with what a hospital attendant would do. And the roles have reversed. The figure that is strong is my mother, and my father has taken on the role of being in need of the support that he was giving at the beginning. My father's health would take dramatic turns. All of a sudden, after having been in the hospital, he felt very good. My father and my son would always be very playful with each other, and here he is on one of his better days. Here he comes to visit me in my home. I live in the southern part of the city, so it takes about an hour's drive, and this would be an excursion for the whole day. And this was an enterprise that he enjoyed the idea of coming to see me, but this became a whole venture. And he would come and stay for an hour, and then just enable him time to go home and have his lunch, and then be able to go to sleep for the afternoon. And I was in the hospital taking these pictures of this child being born. When I got a call from Mexico City to return immediately to go to another hospital. My mother had just had a brain hemorrhage. I found her in a state of coma. The brain hemorrhage was caused by a tumor in the brain. She also had cancer. Here I found myself all of a sudden in a situation of having to decide by myself over the fate of my mother's life. Either she was operated on within the next few hours, or she would inevitably die. The result of the operation was totally unpredictable. She might, in the worst scenario, turn into a paralytic for years. I opted for the operation to try and save her. Here, she's being prepared for the operation. As I sat there in the hospital room looked on as her hair was being cut away. I couldn't avoid the memory of images from concentration camps. I was so overwhelmed with my emotions that taking these pictures was the only way that I thought would enable me to someday understand. Here she's being taken away towards the operating room. 10 days after the operation, and to me, here she looked like a queen. Short time after, this was my mother's 75th birthday, and we invited all our family and friends over. I remember my father being so moved and so unable to express his feelings. But all of a sudden, tears would flow from his eye. And my mother started to make a nice comeback, and her hair started to grow back, and she would spend countless hours trying to... She had lost a great deal of her ability to coordinate visually. So for her to apply her makeup was something that took hours, because she would miss and she would have to do it over again, and she would try to do it, and she was absolutely dedicated to do things on her own as much as possible. She would kid me all the time about looking good for my pictures. It was very painful to see my father being spoon-fed. The brain tumor grew back, and this time the left side of her body was paralyzed. My mother was getting worse by the hour, and I sensed she wasn't going to make it through the night. So we bid each other goodbye. Here, a temporary sign for her grave is being prepared. The burial would take place next day, and according to Jewish law, I wasn't allowed to take pictures then. We didn't tell my father that my mother died. We didn't think it made any sense to tell him. But somehow he knew. And he stopped eating. And he just kept the food in his mouth for hours. Or he would sit there, staring into the air and caressing with his hand an imaginary figure, which surely must have been that of my mother. 3 years after having been sentenced to a scant few weeks, his will to continue wasn't there anymore. His breathing got weaker and weaker, and 9 weeks after my mother, he also passed away. These were the last moments that he and I were together alone. This time, the grave digger had to prepare my father's grave, right next to my mother's. As I'm left with all these images, I remember. I remember how my mother used to ask, why can't we have this closeness and this togetherness all of our lives?